All right, in this episode, I'm back with David Howey, my battle buddy.
Hi, James Cameron.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. Glad to be back with you.
I'm glad you're back. Today, we're going to be talking about MBTI, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and how we use it in the intermediate course. I believe the advanced course is now using it as well.
They do. They do use the MBTI as well.
With this first round of podcasts, I think we're going to try and tie it in with self-awareness. And the theme of the week in the first week of the intermediate course is also self-awareness. Do you feel that MBTI is a good instrument in helping us gain self-awareness?
I do. I find it very useful, the concept that MBTI offers to the students. And MBTI is one of the instruments that is very common in American society. Lots of people have heard of it. Lots of people have taken it, and I think there's a value in using it because it's so widely known. So many people have taken it and used it, so it allows folks to speak a common language. Quite often in the intermediate course, probably in the advanced course, if you ask who's taken this instrument before, a large number of people will say they have done it before, and so all of the instruments that we use, MBTI, SDI, TKI, LSI, and even Element B of FIRO, all of those help the individual, the leader, as if you want to say that, learn a little bit more about their preferences, how they approach problems, how they solve problems, what their tendencies are when they're faced with certain situations. And all of those instruments, and I know you've talked to other folks about the other ones, but they give us kind of a common language where we can communicate about certain things and have an understanding of each other.
Right. Now, some people from the scientific community will critique some of these instruments and saying that, well, it doesn't quite meet the academic rigor of science. And on some of their points, I would agree. But what we're using it for, it's basically a framework to where it asks questions, you respond to those questions, and then basically bundles them up to help you see how your responses might indicate certain preferences, certain tendencies toward certain behaviors. That's basically the limit of it. It's not an absolute. It's not an unchangeable trait. It's a kind of a look. Does this describe your operating pattern? And they are good for that. As far as though trying to make sense of the world by giving everybody one of the, let's say, 16 type labels that come out of MBTI, then you're no longer, I think, within the realm of science or what the instrument is intended for. It's just to help provide some sort of framework as to a way that you might operate to help gather some self-awareness in how I might see myself or see others. Do you agree or disagree?
I mean, I agree with all that. And to me, these instruments are only as good, and we'll talk about MBTI, it's really only as good as the amount of introspection that the user is willing to put into it, how much they're willing to look at what an instrument is telling them and it's whether or not it's accurate for them, how much candor they put into responding to the questions. I think, and I saw an article that one of our colleagues sent out a couple of years ago where someone had published an article that was countering to MBTI, pointing out all the faults. And as I read through the article, what struck me was the faults that were being attributed to MBTI are not actually part of the theory, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So there's also like some misinformation about what the instrument is and what it's supposed to be able to tell you.
Right.
And most people, common knowledge, MBTI gives you a 4-letter combination where there's 8 different possibilities, and you get 4 of the 8 letters, and they're broken down into 4 dichotomies. Basically, it's you have a preference for extroversion or introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, or perceiving and judging. But basically, of those 8, I get 4, and that is supposed to help me understand my preferences. When I'm given one of the 2 pairs, I think the mistake is when people think, if I've got a preference for extroversion, then that's all I can do, and I'm painted into a box. Mm-hmm. I'm painted into a corner. Or if I have a preference for introversion, then I'm that somehow boxes me in, and I can't operate outside of that preference.
Right.
And MBTI specifically uses the word preference so that people will know that I may have a preference for extroversion or introversion or thinking and feeling, but that doesn't mean that I don't need to use the opposite in whatever that dichotomy is.
Right.
To me, it's like if somebody has 2 cars in their garage, they walk out, they're going to go somewhere, they go into the garage, most likely one of the cars they go to without thinking. So that's their preference. And it's the one that they go to, that they automatically go to, and that's the one they drive that day. It doesn't mean they can't drive the other one. It doesn't mean they don't want to drive the other one. It doesn't mean that that they're not capable of it. It's just this is the one that they go to automatically without thinking. And that, to me, is what MBTI is about, is that what behaviors do I go to, what preference do I usually reflect when I'm not thinking about it, when I'm just kind of reacting in a situation.
Okay.
And there may be other factors in the situation that will call on me to use the opposite preference.
Now, if we could bounce off of that a little bit, do you mind sharing what your MBTI preference is, David?
Absolutely not. Mine is ESFP.
Say, okay, ESFP, you're going to be somebody who likes to engage with other people. You're probably going to show more empathy and mercy when it comes to your decision making. The S, you tend to prefer hard, cold facts, probably like checklists and SOPs. And you said your last dichotomy was a P.
Yep.
And so you're probably pretty flexible. And am I safe in making those assumptions after hearing your MBTI preference?
I mean, that's exactly how I see myself.
Okay.
And so yes, that, and people who work with me probably would say, or even at home, yep, that's pretty much who he is.
Am I safe in anybody else who describes their preference as ESFP being the same way? Can I make that? Am I safe in making that assumption?
You know, my feeling about that is you'd need to ask each person as an individual, because there may be someone out there who has the same preference that I do, and they may have they may see those dichotomies differently.
Right.
So, and that's the thing about this instrument or all these theories is then the theory, if I go into the textbook of the theory, it would say what you described as an ESFP is pretty much on target. But I'm not going to tell somebody who has that, quote unquote, this is how you're supposed to be.
Exactly.
Or this is how I expect you to be. Or in the workplace, I expect you to be the one to always do this or that or that or this.
Right.
Because of your preference.
Or I'm on a hiring panel and it's for a job that requires extreme attention to detail. So let me go through and get everybody's MBTI preferences, because I want somebody ending in STJ, an ISTJ or an ESTJ, because from what I've heard, those are the preferences that tend to have the ability to adhere to attention to detail. Is that something the instrument could be used for?
And I think that's a mistake. And I think even the MBTI folks, the folks who own that instrument, discourage it from being used to screen and hire people or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd say we're taking it too far. It's not that. It's not reliable enough to where. Well, first of all, humans are complex, and there's more than 16 different types of personalities. We're looking at 4 dichotomies. Some of those dichotomies are behaviors that we see often in a workplace environment, and it gives us a glimpse into our own patterns of behavior or another's, and they may or may not be accurate to certain degrees for different people.
And what I used to tell students is take it for what it's worth for you. If I look at a person, if I look at James Cameron, I look at this huge mosaic of stained glass, of all these different pieces that make you up. And somewhere in one little corner, part of that is your MBTI preferences. And that's just one little piece of who you are.
Right.
And your experiences, your current life situation, the job that you're in, all that stuff makes up so much more of the person than just that one MBTI score. But it's useful, it's useful. I find it useful for me, and I encourage others to consider it, in that what it helps me do is realize that in a situation, I am most likely to follow my preferences. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's the right thing for the situation based on the conditions, and sometimes it is not. And so I have to recognize, is this a situation where it's helpful for me to use my preferences the way I normally like to, or is this a situation where I kind of have to check myself a little bit and maybe consider different behavior? And that's on me to make that determination.
Right. On one end of the spectrum, we may have, let's say, a horoscope. There was a famous experiment done by a doctor with the last name Forer, F-O-R-E-R, and it's now known as the Forer effect, where he created a personality assessment for his students. I think he was a professor of psychology, and basically all of his students got the same one based on horoscopes, and when they opened their envelope, most of them agreed that it was accurate. Now, that's one end of the spectrum where we just take random, flattering, general things that could be true about anybody. And on the other end, you've got, let's say, a DNA sequence, which is rooted in hard sciences, how a person may be. I would say MBTI is somewhere in between. It's definitely better than horoscope, but you can't take it as a DNA sequence. Okay, this is exactly how all these people will be always, or how this will tend to present itself in the workplace or at home.
Absolutely. And I'll just tell you that MBTI, I believe the language says that it is shaped largely by genetics, and that your first formative years when you're a child also affect what your preferences are.
Well, I think Carl Jung, who started it back in the 1800s, it was a Swiss psychologist. I think that was his premise, was that there are certain innate preferences that we're born with. What I think some of the, if I could just play devil's advocate for a moment, from the science perspective, I'd say that I don't think that's been conclusive yet in any studies, or that I've seen. I think that's one of the things, but it is an interesting premise. But
well, I was just going to say it, and I actually like the way that the SDI theory lays out the question of whether it's nature, whether you're born like you are, or whether your formative years cause you to be who you are. And essentially, there's a book that we have in the classroom written by Tim Scudder, who's the SDI guru. And basically, their take is that it's an irrelevant dichotomy,
right?
Because you are who you are, and you get to a point in your life where you have a certain personality, a certain set of preferences, and whether you were born with it or whether it was socialized into you in your childhood, according to them, it's irrelevant. So we take every person as they come in the workplace, in the classroom, and we take them just as they are. They may have some preferences, and it may line up with the theory. They may take exception to it.
Well, I think that's been one of the great points of discourse throughout the history of the field of psychology, is how much of who we are, is it nature versus nurture? Are we products of our environment, or are we products of our genetics? And I think that the conclusion is that we're combinations of both.
Right.
Now, going back to the argument that you said, Tim Scudder, I think he's the president of SDI, the Strengths Deployment Inventory. Just to play devil's advocate, I would say, well, to me, it might be important, because then I could know what I could change. What lies within my realm of choice? If there is something in me, let's say the color of my hair, I can't change that by changing behavior or thought patterns, I could go out and physically alter it, but other things that are traits versus if I have a tendency, let's say, to think with the heart versus think with the head, is that something that can be changed? I think that's where the implications may lie, but maybe I'm mistaken in seeing that's where maybe whether it's nature or nurture may matter. I don't know.
And I can see that argument. I've heard people say that these instruments are that life is the process of finding out who we truly are, and so we take these instruments and they show us something, and then we ask ourselves, is that really me? Is that really what makes me happy? Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of treading water, and we want to figure out how to not tread water, but have a $100,000 yacht underneath us in our lives. I know for me, we had a colleague that I was in the Army with back in the mid-1980s, and I didn't even know this. And we had taken the MBTI back then. I was like 23 years old. Mm-hmm. He kept the results of all the people in our battalion that took it. And 3 of my letters were different back then.
So what does that say about the theory saying that these preferences don't change, that we are who we are?
Well, the way I look at it, that environment that I was in, it was a combat arms unit. It was very structured, very orderly. There wasn't a lot of, it wasn't a friendly environment. It was kind of brutal.
Okay.
You get your job done, you go to the range, you shoot, you get your stuff fixed, you come in, you do PT at this time. And so I can see how me being in that environment affected the way I answered the questions. Because when I look back on those preferences now, today, I can look back and say, I don't believe that those were my actual preferences.
Right.
I think my actual preferences are closer to the ones that you and I just talked about. Mm-hmm. And so the question isn't, did my preferences change, but did the conditions that I'm living and working in, were they so contrary to maybe my current my true preferences that they caused me to misreport?
Okay. Well, I think when we give the instrument,
that's pretty deep, isn't it?
That's deep.
All right, keep going.
When the instrument is given out, that's passive voice, isn't it? I'll take heat for that later. When the instrument is given out, inside joke, the instructions are to, your mindset should be that you're in shoes off self, kick back on your lazy boy with your favorite beverage. You're not at work. You're not in that battalion where it was high stress, no fail environment. But our happy place, what we would prefer to do. Let's say we had the option to live alone on our own. What choices would we make in the absence of the consequences? I think is the state of mind that you're asked to be in. So a question on the instrument may sound something like, would you rather go to a party with lots of people, or would you rather stay home and read a book? And depending on your state of mind, you could answer that question different ways. At work, you may be required to be delivering a lot of presentations, and in our jobs as instructors, there's a requirement to engage people. And so you may be thinking at work, well, yeah, I need to be in front of people all the time. I prefer, but really, maybe not necessarily. At home, you may prefer quiet time to reflect, read a book, away from noise and distractions, and that's how you get your energy back.
There's also the idea that it's a preference that you have, and so you can overdo your own preference. Mm-hmm. And I'll just give you a perfect example. We said earlier that I have a preference for extroversion, which means I enjoy meeting different people, meeting new people. I'm comfortable in a room of people that I don't know or that I do know. I just like that environment. And I like when you and I were working in the intermediate course, I'd get excited when new folks were coming into the classroom. But that e-preference gas tank gives out after a certain period of time. Because after about 3 weeks, especially after 6 months of 3 weeks, the phrase that I used to use is I get E'd out. I get to the point where I need time alone or very quiet time to kind of recharge my batteries.
In the next episode, I continue my conversation with David Howey on each of the MBTI dichotomies and their leadership implications.
Because to me, this is the one where leaders get challenged the most. Because if I'm the thinking leader with a preference for thinking, Yeah, I want to rely back on that, what you said. This is what the rules say. And sometimes leaders have to be that way.
That's next time on the AMSC podcast. And we welcome your feedback. Please write us at usarmy.leavenworth.tradoc.mbx.amsc-podcast@mail.mil, or you can just write us at amscpodcast@gmail.com.